Hey, quick note before we jump in. If you believe psychedelics deserve mature ethical support, not just hype, the Zindo Project is launching new cohorts for their SIT program every Monday in March. This is the Support, Integration, and Training Program where you learn how to provide real peer support at events in your own community. So use Divergent S10 for 10% off the program. That code also gives us 10% back, which helps support the show. So if you've ever benefited from this culture, it's a good way to give back responsibly. Thanks. Let's get back to the show. Eight 8,000 years. That's how long humans have been using coca. Not cocaine, coca. It's a leaf chewed in the Andes, and it's a leaf exchanged in greeting. It's measured in distance and ritual and survival. And yet today, under international law, that leaf is scheduled alongside fentanyl and heroin. This month, member nations of the World Health Organization are once again confronting the legal status of coca. And the question isn't pharmacological, it's political. How did a plant with a millennia of documented use get globally criminalized? And what does it mean that the international system still classifies it as if it were crack cocaine? So today we're going to start at the beginning with Wade Davis. Welcome back to Divergent States. I'm Elite, as always, with Bryan. How you doing, man?
Hey, what's up, man?
Doing good. I'm excited to get into this. This is part one of our Coca series. And before we even get into the guests, we need to kind of set the table what we're talking about. Right now, under international law, the coca leaf is still classified in the same framework as fentanyl and heroin. And this month, WHO member nations are revisiting that status.
Wow, that sounds like a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. As Wade kind of talked about it, he was saying that it's really symbolic, but hopefully, even if we can move that needle a little bit, just get this out here. Um, that's it we're trying to collapse, that cocaine and coca are the same thing.
Yeah.
The coca in the public imagination, they became the same thing.
Right.
And
Yeah,
if
that
you,
makes sense.
yeah, and if you can't separate the leaf from the alkaloid, the policy conversation never even gets off the ground. So today's guest is Wade Davis. He's an ethnobotanist, anthropologist, author of over 20 books, former explorer in residence at the National Geographic. He was directly involved in the early nutritional studies of the coca leaf in the 70s, research that challenged decades of ideological assumptions. So, we're going to be going over how coca was independently domesticated multiple times, why its nutritional profile was ignored for decades, ideological blueprint of early prohibition, the UN and WHO scheduling framework, and why, despite thousands of years of documented use, coca remains legally equated with crack. So this episode is the historical foundation. We're going to talk ethnobiology with Dennis McKenna next episode, and then we'll examine the lived realities and sovereignty with Manuela Peak. But today we start with the story. So, Bryan, is there anything that you're hoping listeners take away from this one?
Yeah, the same thing that I took away, which is that the plant is not the same thing as the drug.
Absolutely. Let's get into this. And I'm back with Wade Davis. Thank you again so much for being here with me.
Oh, thanks, Lee. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no problem. So before we kind of get in the history or policy of coca, When you say coca, what are we actually talking about?
Well, we're talking about the botanical source of the alkaloid that, once extracted from the plant, is a salt, cocaine hydrochloride, the infamous white powder, which has caused so many complications, so much misery, so much corruption, and so many rivers of blood in the last few generations. But the alkaloid is to the plant what sort of vodka is to potatoes, and the plant itself has been used benignly for over 8,000 years by virtually every culture and civilization, originally from Costa Rica south to Chile and into the northwest Amazon. It's a genus of plants called the Erythroxylaceae. There are hundreds of species, about 17 of which have been found, and perhaps more now, to have trace elements of the precursor of cocaine hydrochloride. But fundamentally, there are two domesticated species: the coca of Colombia, which is Erythroxylon novagranatense, and the coca of southern Peru, which is Erythroxylon coca. Very different in appearance. Both have two varieties. Colombian coca slipped down through Ecuador to the northern coast of Peru, and in the dry desert valleys there, a variety was developed which is called Erythroxylon novagranatense variety turiense. This was a preferred coca of the Inca. It's also the coca used to this day by Coca-Cola, which imports hundreds of tons of coca leaves as a flavoring agent, the only legal importer of coca in the Western world. And then the coca of Peru, the classic coca of the Inca, uh, uh, is echoed in the Northwest Amazon by a species or a variety, Erythroxylon coca variety Ipadu, which Tim Plowman named in the 1970s, my old colleague, because he thought that the coca of the Northwest Amazon was in fact derived from Peruvian coca that in pre-Columbian times came down the Amazon River. But before we leave the arcane points of botany here, the amazing thing is that thanks to the work of a wonderful botanist, Dawson White at Harvard, who has in a sense inherited the coca mantle from Tim Plowman, who died tragically and way too young in 1989. Dawson, using techniques that were unavailable to Tim and I in the 1970s, has shown through DNA that, in fact, and this is truly miraculously, coca was domesticated by humans not once, not twice, but 3 times. And in botany, that's an extraordinary thing. There are very few major cultivated plants that have been independently domesticated. And what this means is that on 3 occasions in pre-Columbian America, human beings came upon this delicate, lovely shrub with delicate leaves and fruits the color and size of rubies, and said, that plant's got something to it, and began the long process of domestication. And the reason they were drawn to that plant was not just its medicinal qualities and its role it can play in nutrition, but because it works, and it works for all human beings. And the way that it works, the subtlety by which it improves lives, is something we could discuss on the podcast.
We'll be right back.
Hey, I'm going to be honest with you guys for a second. Divergent States isn't backed by any network, venture capital, big pharma, corporate sponsor. There's no big Manhattan studio. We record right here in the middle of America in a basement and a closet to bring you serious harm reduction focused conversations about psychedelics and plant medicines without editorial compromise. And this show exists because listeners decided it should. So right now we're building towards our first 50 Patreon supporters to create a real financial floor and keep this independent. So if you value serious psychedelic media that isn't corporate or guru driven, becoming a microdoser on Patreon is how you help build that. Let's get back to the show. For sure. How would you, So yeah, South America is its main ecology. Is there? I know it's mainly the highlands it's grown in.
Well, it's grown, again, depending on the variety. It's grown. It's really a plant of the subtropics. So it grows up to about 6,000 feet along the flanks of the Andes in Peru and Bolivia, and the Yungas, or in areas of Quillabamba below Cusco. But again, a variety was taken down the river or developed in the Northwest Amazon, rather, which is actually propagated by cutting. So one of the things with coca is that you masticate the leaves and you add some alkaline to facilitate the absorption of the small amount of alkaloid found within the leaves. But in the north, and then you, after the quid is exhausted, you reverently place it out from your mouth onto the ground. In the Northwest Amazon, because the variety had half the alkaloid content per dry weight, the indigenous people learned a kind of ingenious technique of harvesting the leaves, drying the leaves over a ceramic griddle, and then putting them into a wooden mortar and pestle, pounding the leaves, and then firing the larger leaves of a plant called yaruma, which to ash, and then the ash added directly to the leaves, the whole thing pounded to a powder, and then finally sifted through palm fiber or cloth. So the ipadu, or in Colombia it's called mambe, is a powdered form of coca leaf that is absorbed in its entirety through orally. So in that case, you're getting the whole nutrients of the plant. I mean, one of the extraordinary things about the history of this plant, and we can talk about its ritual importance, its spiritual value, but the efforts to eradicate the fields, and this is really critically, began fully 60 years before there was a cocaine problem. Now, why was that? Well, at one level, morphine was the first drug extracted from a plant, and obviously, opium, the source, was itself a problem. And by the same token, the second alkaloid to be, or pure natural product to be extracted from a plant, was cocaine in 1859. And because opium was to morphine, and because opium habitual use could be problematic and addictive and destructive, it was sort of just assumed that therefore coca was to cocaine what opium was um, to morphine, which was simply not true. But there was a darker thread to the story. In the 1920s, when health officials and physicians looked up into the Andes, in Peru in particular, and this is at a time when Latin America was very much a place of conquered and conqueror. There was a class division that was unbridgeable. And when they saw poverty, when they saw illiteracy, hunger, social pathologies of one sort or another, because issues of land reform and economic justice came too close to challenging the kind of middle class foundations or upper class foundations of their lives in Lima, they had to find a culprit and an excuse, an explanation for the pathologies. And they settled on coca. And every conceivable ill was blamed on the plant. Now, the amazing thing, and that sort of attitude, which was oozed with contempt, spread throughout the kind of bourgeoisie from Colombia to Bolivia and throughout Peru. Remarkably, in the 60 years that went by before cocaine became a problem in the 1970s as an illicit drug, even as these calls for eradication of the plants were going on, the traditional fields, nobody bothered to do a nutritional study, even though it could have been done easily as early as the 1920s, when finally Tim Plowman in the 1970s, as part of our Botanical Museum Coca project, which I was fortunate to be a part of as a field assistant in the early years of my career, Tim did an assay in which he found horrified our backers at the US government. Yes, coca had a small amount of an alkaloid in it, a benign stimulant in a harsh environment absorbed through the mucous membrane of the mouth. But in addition to this, it was chock full of vitamins and protein. It had more calcium than any plant ever studied by science, which made it perfect for a traditional Andean diet that lacked a dairy product. It had enzymes which enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, which made it perfect for a tuber-based, potato-based diet of the Andes. So again, one simple assay that could have been conducted at any time put into stark profile the draconian efforts to eliminate the traditional fields and showed that this was a plant that had been used with no level of addiction, toxicity, or danger for literally 8,000 years. Now, the interesting thing is, why wasn't that nutritional study done? And it wasn't done because, for ideological reasons, nobody wanted to know that the plant might, in fact, not be a pernicious blight on the culture. And if you look at the writings of these health officials and their pseudoscientific experiments, the pomposity and conceit of their letters and academic papers that just oozed racist contempt for those who revere the plant, the people of the Andes, for whom the use of the plant is the purest expression of daily and spiritual life, you realize that this was all driven by a kind of ideology. So, for example, in 1949, when Bolivia, the conservative government, called on the United Nations to send a commission to look into the so-called coca problem, joined by Peru, the commission, led by a man called Henry Fonda, who at the time was head of Burroughs Wellcome Pharmaceutical Company, announced its conclusions before leaving New York. And then they recited those conclusions upon arrival in Lima. And then they proceeded to spend 3 months traveling around southern Peru, interviewing Catholic priests, alcaldes, mayors, governors, military officials, bourgeois, civic leaders, and lawyers. Yet never once did they speak to somebody from a traditional culture that used the plant. And predictably, their final report called for the elimination of coca within 25 years. And that was a conclusion they had, of course, come to before leaving New York City. The astonishing thing is that those very individuals who were connected to Anslinger and the whole reefer madness era of anti-drug hysteria were the very individuals responsible for the language of the international regulations, treaties, conventions, the 1961 UN Convention on Narcotic Drugs, that dictate global drug policy to this day. It's an astonishing scandal. It's as if we were living in a world where our laws and regulations had been scribed by the Nazi Party. You know, it's just inconceivable that they have continued to dominate the discourse. And what's really interesting is that, of course, when the Spaniards arrived, the Inca and all the pre-Columbian cultures, from Tiwanaku to Paracas, to Nazca, to Moche, Chimu, going back to Chavin, revered this plant. And of course, the Spaniards forbade its use until Toledo, as the viceroy, discovered that the people wouldn't work in the mines without it. So suddenly, not only did coca become permissible, it became the economic mainstay of the Spanish colonies in the 16th and 17th centuries, and well into the 18th century. And what's really interesting is that the literature that came out in the late 19th century, after cocaine, of course, broke over the Western world. It was considered a panacea. Freud celebrated it. It was available in hundreds of products. But pretty soon it was seen to have negative consequences. It certainly wasn't the treatment for morphine addiction that was originally advertised. So, but so far, the coca leaf hadn't fallen into this negative reputation. And so in the late 19th century, you have these wonderful reports of physicians, European and Peruvian, anthropologists, traveling, and just travelers who are kind of mystified about the wonder of this plant. You know, their writing has a kind of an ingenuous quality where, like, well, we know this is a stimulant, but it doesn't feel like a stimulant, but it sure at the end of the day makes your day a little bit better. And you have these just wonderful accounts, like, for example, the International Lacrosse Tournament in Toronto in 1877, when there are two teams, one made up of sort of lumberjacks from Northern Ontario and the other of clerks from the banks in the city. It was a hot, miserable day, and by all logic, the lumberjacks should have swept the field of these skinny little scrawny clerks. But the clerks won the game because they alone were chewing coca. Or there's a fabulous account of Sir Robert Christensen, who at the time was the head of the British Medical Association, when he's in Scotland in the 1880s, I think it was. And he takes a bunch of students on a romp across the Highlands, and they climb a few peaks and come down. And at the end of the day, he sort of said, well, he didn't really eat anything all day. And wow, just 30 crawlers and climb bowl racket, came to had a great meal.
Right.
And he's kind of going, how did we do that? And this touches, it's funny, but it touches on something really important about coca leaf, is the subtlety of its action. It's the most benign stimulant, the most effective stimulant. Coffee is used, but my gosh, drink 4 cups of coffee and try to do anything except jitter. Tea has its usefulness and is a delicious beverage, but it's not very effective. Mate, I would say the same thing. Whereas the qualities of coca are that you have no sense of having a stimulant in your body, but what you notice are the consequences of taking a chew of the leaves, your ability to focus and concentrate, a certain kind of lightness to your step, a certain kind of quiet, subtle confidence, whether you're writing poetry or digital code, and the ability to maintain this sort of state of productivity all through the day, and then simply stop chewing leaves, go home, go for a run, have dinner with your wife, do whatever you do in the evening with your partner, and do it all over again. And before you know it, you've found yourself to be incredibly more effective at your work. And so I think that one of the points of this effort to liberate coca is that this isn't just a plant that's benign. It's a plant that is hugely useful. And I dare say we haven't had a chance to do the kind of medical studies the plant demands simply because of challenges of supply. But I'm convinced that this is a plant that can get people off of serotonin uptake inhibitor drugs like Prozac, that can maybe get people off of Ritalin, Adderall, all these mood-altering drugs that we take for the basic afflictions, psychological afflictions that the Buddhists identify as the bane of all existence, the restlessness, the uncertainty, the distractions, the depressions, whatever it is. I always think, Lee, these are just consequences of the act of being conscious and alive. I mean, these are these small afflictions that undoubtedly were the bane of the existence of pre-Columbian peoples, as they can be the bane of our existence. But to have a benign stimulant like this, which is so effective, and to have it robbed from the well-being of the people, it is, after all, Latin America's perhaps greatest gift to the world, and yet it's been denied and insulted for all of these years. And meanwhile, the war on drugs has exhausted trillions of dollars. Today, there are more people using worse drugs in worse ways than ever before. A real war caused by Prohibition led to 400,000 dead in Colombia, 7 million people internally displaced, 5 million people forced to flee their country. And how would we feel as Americans if drug policies of a foreign country like Canada obliged 85 million of us to have to leave our homes and flee? Well, that's what happened to Colombia. And so today, the cocaine demand around the world still puts enormous pressure on stability in Colombia. And yet we have 250,000 families that grow coca as their livelihood. We have to give them a licit market, an alternative to the cartels. By the same token, a market for coca, an international market on the scale of coffee or tea, which it could achieve, would also give countries like Colombia the tax revenue to pay the cost of peace, having exhausted their treasuries for decades, paying the cost of a war that would not have lasted a week without the sordid profits of prohibition. So liberating coca is also an issue of social justice. It's also an issue of environmental justice. You know, the illicit nature the of the crop leads the cartels ever deeper into the primary forests of the Amazon, resulting in levels of deforestation that remain shocking. Whereas if the coca leaf was legitimized as a crop, it could be sown on cut over land that is now sitting idle. So there are so many reasons to liberate this plant, and yet at the moment, according to the WHO, and they just went through a year-long review that left them unwilling to change the status of the plant. We have this benign, medicinal, nutritional, spiritually vital plant, again, with 8,000 years of evidence of its practicality and its benign nature. And yet, according to international law, it is scheduled as if the equivalent of crack cocaine, fentanyl, and heroin, which is just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, it kind of goes touching on what you had said earlier. You mentioned, it's almost that the blueprint for the drug war was started with it. Like the same reefer madness kind of blueprint was started back with coca, and it's just sad, and especially when you see what kind of difference there is from the purified alkaloid versus just chewing on leaves.
Yeah, I mean, it really has been driven from the start by ideology and the contempt uh, in South America that the dominant bourgeoisie had for anything indigenous. Now, happily, that contempt has largely gone away, and in places like Colombia, in particular, not amongst everybody, but amongst the general population, I would say, and certainly the intellectual elite, the artists, the politicians, there's a new respect for the indigenous people, a new pride in the voices, the multiple voices that are to be found in Colombia. But in the early 20s, as I said, it was, and through the 30s and 40s, and you have to read this language of these people to understand the extent of the contempt. It just oozes, and I don't use the word racism easily or readily or casually. Uh, but the idea that coca causes people to murder each other, that coca, I mean, it's just so ridiculous. It makes reefer madness look, and and it's so strange that we've taken a plant, cannabis, for example, um, which at one point, the possession of a joint could ruin a kid's life if caught, and now we have strains of cannabis that are hugely more potent and stronger. And yet you can get that at any corner store, and it's almost been normalized, and yet it remains a powerful drug. So it's curious that the treatment of cannabis is in such contrast to the way we continue to demonize and criminalize a plant that is infinitely more useful than cannabis. And cannabis is a drug. It's called dope for a reason. You don't want your kids driving a car. I don't particularly want my kids smoking dope at 16 and becoming mellow, as the word always says, because in the dictionary, the word mellow actually means a state of overripe fruit. And the one thing that coca does not do is dull the senses. It stimulates creativity. It stimulates energy, engagement, excitement, uh, contentment, and so many good things.
Yeah, I could definitely see that, and especially qualities that the West would definitely find attractive. It's weird that how ignored it is.
Well,
Kind
you
of,
think about the fact, Lee, that I mean, most of us spend our lives at work hours, at least, looking at a laptop screen. And what would be a better adjunct to your life than a mild plant that you would facilitate your ability to focus at that task for hour and hour on end, to concentrate, to be content while you're doing it, and have a lightness to your being and a kind of a creative step that overcomes the kind of inherent inertia or impediment that comes to all of us as we face that blank piece of paper as a writer, or a blank screen as a writer of digital code. It is so much the perfect natural stimulant for the modern workplace. And it's really the only criminal thing about it is the way it's been kept from all of us by those who are prosecuting this war on drugs, and a war that they really have no intention of winning because they'd all be out of work.
Yeah, exactly. But going back kind of a little bit, how central was coca to Indian civilization?
Well, it's a really important point, and this is why eliminating, or by law or even by cost, access to coca for the Runakuna, particularly the people of the high Andes, the 6 to 7 million, maybe 9 million people who still speak the language of the Inca and still live in a traditional agrarian setting. It's not the same as denying tea to the British or coffee to the Turks or beer to the Germans. It is an act of cultural genocide, in effect, because you cannot be of that culture, of that place, without using the leaves. When you meet someone on the trail, you don't exchange handshakes. You trade perfect crucetas of 3 leaves, and you then turn and face the 4 directions and face the apus and blow the energy of the essence of the leaf to the mountain deities. And the gesture of doing that, that's called a puke, is a spiritual gesture that aligns you with the earth. And in the same sense that a cloud rises over a mountain and condenses to bring rain to the fields and fertility and well-being to the lives of the living, so you're sending the spiritual energy of the plant out into the world. And that may be a spiritual gesture, but the actual exchange of the leaf is also a social gesture that binds you into the community. Every field that is harvested is sprinkled with leaves. In the time of the Inca, you could not approach a holy shrine if you did not have leaves in your mouth. If you did have leaves in your mouth at the time of your death, your path to the afterlife was assured. Distance was measured not in terms of miles or kilometers, but in terms of coca quids or chews. The famous court oracles, who in an oral tradition lacking the written world would have to recite the entire mythological history of the Inca, did so, facilitated by the use of the leaves. And the leaves allowed the Inca to march armies across the Atacama Desert and the far reaches of the empire. It allowed the runners to deliver messages from Quito to Cusco in less than a fortnight. Fish from the sea, fresh for the table of the Inca in Cusco. And so coca is absolutely entwined in the cultural reverence for landscape, a kind of sacred geography that typifies that part of the world. And you must chew coca, and you must chew it properly with the proper ritual activities. Nothing offends the people of the Andes more than tourists stuffing their mouths with coca leaves like horses eating hay, as they say. And one of the problems, Leaf, for those of us who are advocating the liberation of the plants, is that so few people have experienced what coca actually can do for you. People will go and have mate de coca, coca tea, served up by a fancy hotel. Almost every major hotel in the Andes has a source of coca tea in the lobby, big vats of it for treatment of altitude sickness, for which it's very effective. And people kind of try to put the leaves in their mouths, but they don't understand that you must use some kind of alkaline. It could be ashes, it can be limestone, all prepared by indigenous technologies. But You can use bicarbonate of soda, baking soda, but you must change the alkalinity of the mouth to have any kind of effect. And so we don't really have enough people who have experienced the benefits of the plant. So we don't really have a constituency for it. In the case of marijuana, what led to its decriminalization and legalization in places like Canada, where I live, was just civilian demand of politicians. People both wanted it for medical purposes and for recreational purposes. And they reached a certain critical mass where people were simply not accepting the fact that a young woman in college could have her entire life ruined by possession of a joint of a relatively innocuous herb. We don't have that kind of constituency yet of coca. That's why we're people like myself and Andrew Weil and a whole cadre of kind of colleagues in Colombia and Peru, and certainly Dennis McKenna being one of our key collaborators. Dennis and I hosted a Wisdom the Leaf conference outside of Cusco in the Sacred Valley about a year ago now, that drew together all the advocates from Europe and North America and Latin America. And it was a very successful conference, but there's a big movement to liberate the leaves. It's not just an issue of herbal medicine. It's an issue of human rights, of environmental rights, of social justice, of the well-being of all of humanity. It's really a plant that can be that effective. And it's funny. I mean, we have such a strange relationship with plants. I mean, originally coffee was a medicine. Then it was a plant of sedition, and if you had coffee, you could be killed. I mean, in Istanbul, the Sultan used to dress up in disguise and behead people he caught drinking coffee. And then with the Industrial Revolution, we domesticated coffee because it was a vital tool, along with steam and coal, that allowed the Industrial Revolution to happen. Until the mid 17th century, you couldn't drink the water in any European capital or city because it was polluted. And so you would drink spirits, alcohol, mead, wine, beer, or spirits. And the whole continent was kind of mildly besotted. And you could work a field or harvest a field or even work, as a craftsperson if you're a little bit drunk, but you couldn't work a machine tool. And so suddenly these three central nervous system stimulants, coffee, tea, and chocolate, arrived in Europe. They were highly valued, dispensed in these centers of intrigue that became known as the coffee houses or the penny universities. And these places became center of intellectual intrigue because instead of being in your tavern with your brow and your beer, you were wired on caffeine and you couldn't shut up. And in fact, the first mob that stormed the Bastille, that sparked the French Revolution, left from Voltaire's favorite coffee house, the Café de Foy. So, we domesticated coffee and incorporated it. So we suddenly have a coffee break when everybody knows it's just a euphemism for absorbing another dose of the drug. It's like we call a cocktail party, which is an excuse for people to stand around in a circle and imbibe alcohol. And yet, for some reason, we have this blind spot in and around a plant that can, in fact, be more beneficial than anyone other than I can think about. So I think it's really important, at least from my point of view, when we talk about liberating coca, we're not really talking about, having indigenous people have the rights to use coca, because most places where coca grows, in Colombia, in Peru, and in Bolivia, it disappeared in Ecuador in colonial days for mysterious reasons. But in the other three countries, it's still completely available to indigenous people, be it the Nasa in Cauca or the Arawakos and Huiwa and Kogi and Cancuano and Sierra Nevada in Colombia, or all the many peoples of the Northwest Amazon, the Barasana, the Tacuna, the Macuna, the Cubeo. They all have their powder, mambe powder, and of course in Peru and Bolivia. So indigenous people have access to coca. It's not about that. Um, there are issues about the cocaine trade driving up the price and making it unavailable. That's a different sort of economic issue. But the real thing about coca, in my opinion, is that it could be a true major export crop. Now, obviously, most of the world is not going to want to either chew dry leaves or put spoonfuls of a very fine powder, the consistency of talcum powder, on their tongues. But we can readily take all the essence of the leaves and transform it into a chewing gum or a lozenge or candy or some other readily and palatable form of use, right? And it would be so good for so many people. And I think it would get people less interested in using the alkaloid, the cocaine hydrochloride. It would probably many people would find that moving from coffee to coca was really quite benign, and it would be just. So my vision is not just on a small scale. I'm thinking of trying. My vision would be to unleash an international market in coca as a serious commodity along the lines of chocolate um, and tea and coffee, and there were efforts in this direction in the early years in the 19th century. The Dutch grew um, coca in Indonesia. Coca is an example of the old adage that there's no such thing as good and bad drugs. There are only good and bad ways of using drugs. I mean, even cocaine hydrochloride, we mustn't demonize it too much because, after all, it remains our most effective nose, throat, and ear, and an aesthetic for nose, throat, and ear surgery. It has very valuable medical uses. Um, uh, but coca has this capacity to, really. I mean, there was a funny thing that happened, Lee, in Qatar at the World Cup in Doha, where the Argentinian, I wrote about this for Rolling Stone, the Argentinian team arrived there with 1,100 pounds of mate, of yerba mate, which is um, the caffeine containing plant that is the national beverage of Argentina. Uruguay, that also reveres mate, yerba mate, only turned up with 900 pounds because they didn't expect to last as long in the tournament. Well, if the Peruvian team had arrived with 1,000 pounds of coca, they all would have been arrested. And why? You know, uh, it's just time that this wrong be righted. And I think when it is, and some people say, for example, well, aren't we worried about corporate interests getting hold of the coca plant? Well, unfortunately, that's already happened. It's called Coca-Cola, um, which has legally imported coca leaves since the formula of the beverage was invented. And it's also called the Cartels, who are growing coca for illicit cocaine on more land in more places than ever before to service an international demand that, for reasons I abhor and do not understand, is exploding throughout Africa, throughout Australia, throughout Asia, way beyond the traditional markets of Miami, New York, London, and Los Angeles. So we have to do something about this, and certainly part of a strategy is to give people an alternative on the ground in Colombia, in particular, those who are growing the plant. But also, it's a plant that I think can help more people in more ways than any other, and it's completely criminal. What is criminal about it is the way that it's been demonized unjustly um, uh, by forces with such a wicked ideological motivation, going back to the early um, individuals who wrote of the plant with such slander and such lies and such contempt.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's such a weird. It's It's strange how much it's been demonized when so much of we see plant medicine in the West and we automatically think, oh, plant medicine, but that's the one that gets ignored every time. At what point does coca stop being coca and become cocaine?
Well, that's a pure extractive process, which is, I mean, and it's one of the reasons that crop substitution programs are delusional, because the two steps, and I don't pay too much attention to cocaine, uh, but the two steps to transform it into a very portable paste um, are very simple. You need kerosene and sulfuric acid or hydrochloric and sulfuric acid, and you can do that in a jungle lab set up at whatever scale you want to, and that product then can be transferred either obviously either then transformed into the cocaine hydrochloride, the actual pure drug, in the jungle, or the paste can be transported. But for a campesino, you could take your entire harvest and bring it to a facility that turns it into paste, and that paste could be carried in a mochila, in a small backpack, 30 miles through the jungle to the roadhead. Well, the idea of being able to carry, 30 bushels of bananas, 30 bushels of cacao, or whatever other agricultural product purported to be an economic substitute for that harvest, it's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen, and it's not happening except in certain kind of set pieces. Um, One of the things that was so interesting is that when I spent in the 1970s 15 months in the field studying coca with Tim Plowman, uh, when I came back, there was a job offer at the USDA that Tim wanted me to apply for. And he then told me, if you take the job, I'll kill you. And I thought that was interesting. So I went out to Beltsville, Maryland, to the USDA, found my way to the office of this bureaucrat. The first thing I knew about him is that he was DEA, not USDA. Secondly, I noticed he was a drug addict because I couldn't get in his office for the cigarette smoke. Then I noticed that his walls were covered with seized drug paraphernalia. It was like going into the office of an anti-pornographer and having the walls papered with pornography. And he sat on the other side of a desk, and it was at mid 1970s. So he had this big butterfly collar, gold chains around his neck, gold nuggets on his wristwatch band, and the big hairy red chest popping out of this shirt, and this kind of loud jacket on top of it all. And it turns out that all they had distilled from the work that we had done, which included the nutritional study of the plant, was that Tim and I were good at finding coca fields. And so the job was for me to go down into these fields in Peru and Bolivia, find the biological pests that would predate and destroy coca plants, bring those pests back, whether they were fungi or insects, and allow so they could be manipulated genetically and reintroduced to be more damaging to the fields. And this program went ahead, by the way, and they had secret plots growing in Kauai, in Hawaii, to do this kind of work. And they did come up with a fungus that they tried to reintroduce, and they did reintroduce. And it was only Bill Clinton who shut that down because he feared that Latin America would see it as a form of biological warfare, which indeed it was in a sense. But when I'm looking at this guy in this office, now I'm only 21 years old, right? And I'm thinking, I know this guy. I've seen him 1,000 times. I mean, where have we met? And it was only when I left the office that I realized I had never met him, but I had been around him a great deal, because when we were in Colombia in those years, the Medellin cartel, and I lived in Medellin, was emerging. Carlos Leather, who flew the cocaine through the Bahamas, had a finca just up the road from us. And nobody at the time knew how bloody the trade would become and how murderous. But the character of these people was pretty obvious from the get-go. And I realized that I had never met this man in that office in Beltsville in Maryland, but I had met him 1,000 times because his vibe, his energy was exactly that of the cartel. It was a real kind of breakthrough moment for me because I realized that, at least on a level of metaphor, the DEA and the cartels were, in a sense, two sides of the same coin. Neither side had any interest in ending the war on drugs. The DEA agents and all this apparatus that was spending up to $60 billion a year at one point, all that would evaporate and they'd all be out on the streets looking for work. And of course, the cartel had no interest whatsoever in legalizing cocaine. They would see their profits plummet. And so, for those who suggest that legalizing or liberating the coca leaf would be a gift to the cartels, it really makes no sense because they couldn't care less about the legal status of coca leaves. They've thrived with coca being illicit, and they would continue to thrive if it was legalized or liberated. And 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 the very rules that prohibit the extraction of cocaine hydrochloride and the distribution of it and the selling of it would remain in place no matter what the fate of the legal status of the actual bush was. So it really is apples and oranges. It has nothing to do with facilitating the lives of the cartel. And the cartel could care less about this issue. Um, they just want a supply of leaves, and they're getting that whether the leaf is exclusively available to them or whether it in fact is also available to those who want to use it in a proper and benign and historic way.
And as you kind of mentioned, feels like they would have an incentive to keep it illegal, to keep their prices up. So
Without doubt.
yeah, so if someone listens to this and they remember just one thing about coca, what would you say that should be?
That it's the divine leaf of immortality. That its effects are subtle to the point of being almost imperceptible, but dramatic in terms of what it can do to improve daily life for almost anyone employed in the workplace and in daily life in general. It's medicinal, it's nutritious, it's uplifting in a very benign and effective way. And it's a plant that it should be every human's right to know.
Yeah, I agree. And we've got, I think, Dennis McKenna coming up in our next episode. He's going to be talking about the ethnobiology. And later, we're doing Manuela Peak, I think, BICQ. She's done a lot of activism around Ecuador and Bolivia, and with the indigenous rights, and to kind of give us a view of on the ground and what's coming up. So yeah, I'm really excited about this. I know we could probably go for another couple hours. It's really interesting how deep this one subject goes, and that's why I wanted to kind of bring it up. So yeah, I'd love to talk a little more. I've got about 15 more minutes to chat on the Patreon section if you want, a little more relaxed. So if you guys want to hear that, go over to patreon.com/divergent states, and we'll talk a little more over there. All right, so that was Wade Davis. And whether you agree with every claim or not, here's the tension I want you to sit with. For thousands of years, coca functioned as a cultural, nutritional, and spiritual plant. And in less than a century, it was legally equated with one of the most stigmatized drugs on earth. And that shift didn't happen accidentally. It happened through policy, through ideology, through narrative. And that's what this series is unpacking. So, next episode, we're going to go into ethnobiology with Dennis McKenna and what that plant actually is, how it functions in the body, and what's been misunderstood. And after that, we're going to take a look at the lived realities in Indigenous sovereignty with Manuela Peak, because policy debates are one thing, but real people live with the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So, Bryan, when you hear that when you heard that coca is scheduled pretty much the same as heroin and fentanyl, what was your reaction?
Well, I mean, at first I get it because I understand that we all see coca as cocaine and the way it's portrayed in the media, and how dangerous some of those areas where the crops grow are just because of its function. But when you look at the history of its function, and you realize that the plant itself is absolutely nothing like the drug. If anything, it's more like coffee. It's more like tobacco. It's something that we all would use in America if it was an abundant plant. So knowing now, or I guess with
No,
what
I
I've
mean,
with what I've learned from this interview, I'm kind of blown away that the plant is that it's like imagine if the coffee bean was made illegal. It just doesn't.
yeah, like the plant itself was made, and it doesn't make sense. You're right, and
Right.
that's why I think this matters. Why we even brought this story to the conversation, and it's hearing just all the stuff that he
Yeah.
brought forward, talking about how long it's been used, and just traditional use, and the the narratives that are built around coca and were used as a blueprint for further criminalization down the road.
Right. And then you look at it and it's like, man, there's been a lot of plants that have been made illegal. Uh, cannabis for a while. Um,
I mean, ayahuasca has been
yeah.
illegal, kind of the same plant.
Peyote.
Psilocybin mushrooms, peyote, mescaline, yeah. And
Absolutely.
it's yeah, so that's why I wanted to kind of bring this series in the first place, because a lot of the issues that we talk about here, it just happens to be a more benign one actually than most of them. It's coca.
Mhm.
So yeah, this isn't about hype. It's about asking whether we flatten something complex into something convenient. So did you have any like assumptions about coca versus cocaine that you didn't necessarily, like see at first?
Yes, I thought for sure that like coca, like if you chewed on the plant, you'd get the same thing that you got from cocaine. Just,
Right.
you know, like you'd bite into it, numb cheeks, and all this like feeling like twacked out kind of vibe. But that is not the case. Like
Yeah.
not even close. Like it kind of surprises me how different the experience of cocaine is versus this described experience of
Of coca.
of coca, and it's
Yeah.
almost night and day.
It re- yeah, I think that surprised me the most. That just how widely it was used and everywhere. The
Mhm.
ceremonial, it's crazy. But
It kind of makes me want to try it.
yeah, a little bit,
Yeah, like I kind of want to go down there and just like get my own little bag and like just chew on it, see what happens,
yeah,
because it doesn't
take your
seem.
3 little leaves and a little ash or alkaloid or whatever you got and
Yeah,
try it out, see what it's like.
I bet you $10 it'd probably be underwhelming. I'd be like, this wasn't worth the trip.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So for just that, anyway. All right, guys. So if you value long form conversations like this and you want independent discussions that don't devolve to fear or hype or corporate framing, support the show. Patreon.com/Divergent States. That's what keeps us independent. It's what allows us to build this series without watering it down. There's an extended version of this conversation with right now with Wade up on Patreon. More relaxed, more behind the scenes. And if you want to go deeper, it's there. If you care about harm reduction in real world sittings, I want you to point to you the Zendo project. They offer sit training. They sit with you, not guide you, for psychedelics peer support. Our listeners get 10% off that training with the code Divergent S10. And that 10% also comes back to support the podcast. So if you want to deepen your understanding and support the show at the same time, that's the way to do it. So next episode up, we got Dennis McKenna, and we'll see you then. We're just getting started.
Oh yeah, see you then.
Psychedelics can take you deep, but you don't have to go at it alone. Fireside Project is your trusted companion on the psychedelic path. If you're having a tough trip, their free, anonymous support line is just a call or text away at 62-FIRESIDE. Planning the journey? Fireside certified coaches offer personalized video sessions to help you prepare and integrate, starting with a free 20-minute consult. Whether you're on the path, in the middle of it, or just getting started, Fireside is here for you. Learn more at firesideproject.org.